Chapter 9. The Carnation Revolution. The ceremony on the 25th of April marks the anniversary of freedom, but the feeling this year is one of fading hope. Not once, not twice, but 3 times Portugal is on the brink of asking for, or having forced upon her, financial aid from outside her borders. Liberdade. It's the 25th of April, 2011. In Miranda de Corvo, Stephen and I attend a commemoration service to mark the Revolução dos Cravos. We enter a room that is the usual setting for school meals, but now has rows of chairs arranged in front of an improvised stage. Behind the stage, there's a large screen on which images and text is being displayed, and 3 men sit on chairs in front of this, while a 4th man, who is standing at a microphone, is speaking. The Portuguese flag and that of Miranda de Corvo fall in pleats against the shafts of poles which are positioned at slight diagonals pointing away from the 4 men. A beautiful arrangement of flowers sits on a table within this tableau. When we arrive, there are no easily accessible seats, so Stephen and I walk along the side of the room to the back wall and stand there, eventually leaning against it as the time passes. Our rudimentary skills with the language enable us to garner odd words, but not the meanings of the monologues being delivered. One gentleman finishes his speech with an invitation for the president of the Câmara Municipal of Miranda de Corvo to start hers, and an elegantly dressed woman takes the stand. We recognise the face from posters we have seen around the town, and we have certain ideas about the person behind these images. Our friend Mary has a low opinion of the woman because she does not like English people. Other opinions about her come from neighbours who say that she's like all politicians, just in it for herself. Yet all around us in Miranda de Corvo, we see investment that the president of our council has attracted to the area, and due to this we tend to judge the woman positively. The president begins to speak, and her voice commands attention. The audience is carried along in the wave of passion with which she talks about Portugal, and in particular the small area she represents. From slumped postures, turning programme pages and daydreams, people are noticeably pulled back into the room, as backs straighten and attention returns to the stage. From the little of the ceremony that Stephen and I comprehend, it is enough for us to understand that this year's talk of freedom is particularly poignant. Chapter 10. Maio. I was learning that being in a marriage required faith, and as with religious faith, there were times when logic had to be ignored. Sometimes nothing made sense, and during those times you had to fight to believe in a happy ending. Fields of colour. There is a patch of land about 30 metres square where the old crumbling houses of the village end, and a rocky track leads down towards the road. A fig tree appears to be doing very nicely beside an old well on the corner, opposite the disused stone washing troughs, and a stand of tall eucalyptus trees are aided in their quest to tower above all by the raised terrace they have found themselves fortunate to occupy. On the small area of land below the stand, blades of grass are pushed aside by the stems of bright orange come red poppies, which form intricate patterns of colour, interspersed with simpler couplings. A few of the red flowers grow at diagonals, pointing away from each other, and it appears almost as if a 2-finger salute is being made at the neighbouring trees, which have height but lack the poppy's vibrancy. Part-time neighbours. At the beginning of January, when Stephen and I were still living amongst a jumble of things that had recently arrived from England, and the added jumble that emerges every year at Christmas, The British couple who owned the house next door to us spent their usual New Year break in their holiday home. Their presence at that time has all but disappeared from my memory. The only lasting souvenirs are of when they introduced themselves to us, bearing gifts of an oven mitt, tea towel, and apron, bearing the images of a household cavalry guard, and popping in sometime in the middle of their stay with a Christmas cactus as a moving in present for us. I do not know why now, but I remember too the expectation when we went to their house for drink that their home would be cold, only for it to be the reverse, as Joyce ensured that her husband Steve kept the fire piled high with logs. The couple had left without us knowing much about them, and vice versa. But this changed when 2 days before the end of April, our part-time neighbours returned. In hindsight, it's easy to see that after only 5 months in our new home, Stephen and I were still adjusting to our new life, and many things remained unresolved both practically and emotionally. However, we had begun to consider ourselves settled, and when our neighbours returned, we had time to build on the previous introductions, starting with dinner at ours the day after their arrival. As was the pattern then, and has largely remained, travellers from the UK tended to bring the wet weather with them, and we thought that mince that had been slow cooked the day before would make a lovely cannelloni for the four of us on a damp evening. Over dinner, a few bottles of wine were polished off, and Joyce's language took on a fuller Scottish tones and expanding vocabulary, while Steve's eyes became increasingly glazed over. Of course, Steve and I showed no signs of the alcohol we consumed. Before the evening ended, the dinner invitation was reciprocated by our neighbours, and a few days following the cannelloni, we were next door to dine. Conversation was easy, and a common connection was John, who we discovered had also sold our neighbours their house about 6 years before selling us ours. Other common subjects were the Major and Maria, with whom, despite sharing a longer history, they had experienced little first-hand conversation due to the language barrier. Of course, another connection was Mary, with whom we had become friends and who looked after their house in their absence. This time, when our neighbours departed for the UK, there was a hole where they had been for the previous 9 days. In a little time, Steve and I picked up from where we had left off, and the easy conversation in English with people who we now thought of as friends was forgotten, as the more trying conversations in Portuguese with people whom we hoped would become friends took centre stage once more. Yet I believe a house should be lived in, and when we looked over a wall at an empty building, I felt a melancholy. The Association. It was Pedro and Lourdes who had told us about the Association, a type of social club which is near the little chapel in our village, and it is open Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays by neighbours who volunteer their time to serve drinks. The Association is somewhere coffee can be sipped, a glass of wine quickly consumed, conversation partaken in, and a game played with iron discs about the size of a McVitie's digestive biscuit, and 2 metal pins about 10 centimetres long that are placed 5 metres or so apart, and which the players attempt to knock over with the digestive biscuits. Steve and I had known about the association since December, but up until then we had never been there. We both felt strongly that it was important for us to become part of village life, but it was I who thought the social club would be a good place to go to achieve this. It did not mean, however, that I had fewer reservations than Stephen about entering a place that would be very much a clique. We would be able to communicate little, and any protection from speculation about our relationship that had been afforded to us because of our relative anonymity would be stripped away. Putting anxiety aside, though, we went to the building one Friday night, only to find it closed. Another few weeks passed us by before we opted for a Sunday to venture into the unknown. and this time we were met by 3 teenagers and a man who looked to be in his 70s. It was afternoon, so our bon dia was exchanged for a bourdon, and as we ordered coffees, which were the small black espresso kind. Finishing our first drinks rather quickly, we ordered 2 glasses of red wine before sitting down at a table. The place we found ourselves in was a very basic, largish square room where the bar area took up one corner, creating an L-shaped space where each of the 4 plain, small round tables were complemented by 4 functional matching chairs. There was a television showing football when we arrived, a stereo which sat beside it on another shelf, and a football table standing in the small section of the L. The elderly gent sat at another table, and he was familiar to us in the context of exchanged greetings when we passed him in our car. So although no introductions had been made up until this point, it now seemed the ideal opportunity. At first, the presence of the teenagers cowed us, but when 2 more glasses of wine were brought to us with the indication that they had been bought by our neighbour, we felt that doing nothing would be worse than doing something. We got up from our seats, thanked the man, and introduced ourselves. Over the following weeks and months, Manel T became one of our best friends here in our new life. He was 73 years old when we met, or as he told us, 37, reverse the figures. Conversation that Sunday informed us that the teenagers at the association were his grandsons and a nephew, and this was our first real understanding of how tightly knit our little community was. The concept of such close family ties struck Stephen and I as strange, but as with the keeping of chickens and growing our own food, the reality should not have been as alien as it was, because our own parents and grandparents had travelled little from where they were born, married someone from the same town, and had aunts, uncles, cousins and in-laws close by to provide support. Stephen, Manel, the teenagers and I eventually established names, but along with the familiar, such as Philippe, there was a Rui, which, although difficult for us to understand when it was first told to us, time made sound as common to us as a David or a Richard. For Stephen, it was only when Christmas arrived again that he was able to translate his name into Stivan, because of St. Stephen's Day, and Manuel T could finally pronounce it. With glasses of wine costing the equivalent of around 30 pence, we became very merry very cheaply, and the more we had to drink, the less self-conscious we felt. So when further people arrived, we hesitated little when asked to play the game with the digestive biscuits. Being involved in an activity helped paper over missing language and embarrassing silences. And although we played badly, understanding no more than the basic rules, laughter seemed to be directed at the situation rather than at us. On this occasion also, Stephen and I were introduced to a bar snack called tremoso, which is a type of bean that you eat by popping it out of its paper-thin shell. In a former life, I would have been unlikely to try any unknown food, but the alcohol made me less reticent, and I was also sensitive to my outsider status. I could not say that I liked the beans, which had a texture similar to cheddar cheese, but little taste other than that which the salt provided after being sprinkled over them. But they were often part of the general ambience, and I usually managed 1 or 2 in those situations. Stephen and I enjoyed ourselves greatly at the association and promised ourselves to return the following week. A drop of sense. There are times when we need to be brought up. I'll start that again. There are times when we need to be brought to a stop. Perhaps we have been having too many late nights, or maybe we are working too hard. And it could even be that we have spent so long caring for others that we no longer think about ourselves. But when I put my foot in the ducks' swimming bowl one Sunday night, I knew that my excess was too much drink. My body had been processing a steady intake of alcohol, mainly red wine, over the past 5 months. But I thought that I was doing all right and tended to ignore hangovers becoming more regular and our life becoming affected negatively as a result of this. There were such things as the visit Steve and I paid to a wildlife park, when midday sun and the previous evening's drinks forced us to see only a little of what the nature reserve had to offer. When the wet foot and angry exchanges of words with Stephen, which I cannot recall, came along, I was forced to consider my situation and question myself about the fourth restless night in a row, the acid indigestion over the past week, the fatigue of early mornings, and the lethargy of daytimes. However, despite the questions, an even greater shock was needed to rouse me to full consciousness. And this happened on the second Sunday we came back from the association. I hung from the window ledge and knew immediately that the result of my actions would very much be mine to feel. To my right, there was the top of the tall gate to our house, and if I had thought that these could aid my escape through the bathroom window, it was now evident that although tantalisingly close, my feet would not reach them. I fleetingly thought of pulling myself back up, but my grip on the granite sill was weakening, and I doubted the strength in my arms, so I dropped. The narrow track from our house led me beneath the street lights and towards the wider road that passes through the village. I must have continued walking, but I only became conscious of my surroundings again when the street lights and the few scattered houses ended and I was enveloped by darkness. Above me, the stars shimmered in the shifting night air, but their light was overpowered by the blackness of tarmac beneath my feet and the dense forest of pine and eucalyptus on either side. The landscape opened up after about 15 minutes, and for a while houses lined the road. But signs of life died away quickly, and further minutes walking along dark roads followed once more until I reached Miranda de Corvo. The cafes near the lit Praça José Falcão were busy, and I wanted to be part of what I saw. But the scene around me was populated by people at least 20 years younger than me, and even had I still been single, I would not have fitted in. Yet the longings of a middle-aged man who had found himself distanced from a language, culture, customs, and outlook he had firmly associated with, and who was losing himself to self-pity because of unemployment and the loss of friendships that came with it, were no less keenly felt because he knew how ridiculous they were. Off the square it was quieter, and under a shelter open on two sides to the night's air, a television was being watched by 5 men. I went into the cafe which served this area and ordered a coffee, which I took outside. The alcohol was beginning to wear off, and my right foot, which I had landed heavily on when I dropped from the window, was beginning to hurt. The caffeine helped my mind clear further, and the pain in my foot was less now that I was sitting down. I had one eye on the television, and with the other I observed the 5 friends. The men sat at tables that were a little distant from each other, but they laughed together at one of those reality TV shows, the one that gathers people together in a jungle and subjects them to trials. After a while, I perceived something in their behaviour that gave the impression they had begun the evening not as a group but independently, and I found a common thread of conversation throughout it. I stayed at the cafe a little longer, but noting the companionship the men found in each other's company only aggravated my feeling of isolation. So I got up, I paid for my coffee, and I walked to the station where disappointment awaited me in the form of an empty taxi rank. I wanted to blame Stephen for the sudden weariness which the accumulation of events over the previous hours had brought on. But I knew it was not his fault, and more piquantly, I knew the unhappiness he must be feeling at that moment was definitely caused by me. Perhaps locking myself in the bathroom and escaping from him had been mere dramatics on my part, but reading the above account many months after the event hints at something more, a cry for help which I was unable to voice. My foot was hurting greatly now, and I tried not to dwell on the return journey home. I pushed aside thoughts of the dark roads I had trodden with a head full of anger and the stubbornness of a donkey, of the dark forests that my drink-addled mind of the time had not thought to inhabit with ghosts and madmen, and of the added trial of my return being all uphill. With my head cast down, I watched my feet fall one in front of the other, while my hopes, or perhaps they were prayers, were that Stephen was all right. I attempted anger once more as a way of combating the worry. Why hadn't he come looking for me? But then I realised that he most definitely would have tried, and that due to the alcohol he had consumed and his state of mind at that time, there was a distinct possibility he had had an accident in the car. Foot continued to fall in front of foot, but the evenness of the steps became less as I favoured left side over right. Somewhere on the fast road between two villages either side of where I lived, I picked up a long stick which I began using to help me walk. I didn't use it as the additional limb, as a conventional walking stick, but as an aid to help me keep time. With the stick in my right hand and at my side, I swung it in an anti-clockwise direction. It lifted behind me, rose over my head, and came down a few feet in front of me. The hypnotic rhythm of each monotonous 2-meter sweep of branch and arm helped me put thoughts and feelings in order. I remembered that when I had said goodbye to Britain, it had not been while standing on the deck of the ferry, watching other passengers and fingers of frost hold onto the vessel's rails. No, at that time I was full of excitement and secure in the knowledge that in the palm of the hand which held mine, it was not only Stephen's future that could be read, and we had both felt relief that we were finally on our way. The months before our departure from the UK had been difficult. Delays involving the sale of the flat were taking their toll, as our new life was forced to wait and the relationship of our neighbours downstairs deteriorated. Then, as we were on the brink of seeking sanctuary at my sister's house in Clacton-on-Sea, another blow had come our way. When the removal van, which had come to collect our possessions, ended up breaking the cover of a disused manhole, I did not know how Stephen kept himself together. I believed the man I loved had nothing left to fight with. But inside the flat once more, he made a phone call to the water board and was told that the responsibility might be theirs or it might not, but that someone would arrive to assess the situation within a couple of hours. During the walk home in Portugal that night, I remembered how I said my goodbyes to England whilst watching. I remembered how I'd said my goodbye to England whilst watching the prow of the ferry make a passage through the water. I'd noted how reluctant the waves were to leave the side of the boat, and thought of memories that returned time and again, losing momentum and clarity as new ones form. I knew that I was going wrong with Stephen, and because of that, it meant that I had a chance of getting it right. Making good with more than a lick of paint. I feared at first that my right foot had been broken by my drop from the window, and the next day Stephen cared for me as he had done when I had reached home. There had been no argument when I entered the kitchen, and though my shame caused me to remain silent and ignore his pleas for me to accompany him to bed, he covered me with a blanket and added to my self-hatred because I was incapable of returning any warmth at that moment. 3 days passed and we healed. On the 4th, we went around John's house to do some painting that we had agreed to do. Due to Chicken John's health problems, he was not very mobile and tended to spend most waking hours in his kitchen, where, along with people who called for various reasons, the smoke from an average 40 cigarettes a day had made its way to the ceiling and walls over a 7-year period. John remained a character we could not figure out. We knew he had upset many people in the past, but our contact with him had not ended with the completion of the sale of our house to us, and he frequently offered to help with things such as situations where the language was a barrier. The distance we tried to keep from him was due more to our desire to have little contact with English-speaking people in Portugal. But when he had asked us if we were interested in painting his kitchen for a few euros, we were grateful for the chance to earn a bit of pocket money. The work was hard because we first needed to clear surfaces and move furniture and wipe away as much of the nicotine stain as possible. And when we began to paint, it was difficult not to lose heart as the brown reappeared through the newly applied whitewash within minutes. John kept us supplied with tea, and when we went out for something to eat, it was for Tosta Mista in a nearby cafe that Stephen believed made some of the best toasted ham and cheese sandwiches around. By the end of the afternoon, following a few more hours painting, we had managed to coat everything at least once, and the first areas to be painted that morning had even received a second covering. But we left discussing how many more coats would be needed to eradicate the beige. Buying lunch had not been expensive, but we had agreed on little money for the painting job, and that, along with the time it had occupied, persuaded us to take a packed lunch the following day. We returned to John's with a couple of cheese rolls to a room that definitely looked fresher, if not white. At the end of that second day, John seemed happy enough with our work and asked us if we were interested in painting his bathroom next. We agreed to the proposal, and with a learnt trick or two up our sleeves, the white of the substance in the tin was not resigned to be was not resigned to a tainted beginning when it reached the walls. The fight for our crops and a far from silent night. As our neighbours sprayed developing potato plants against mildew, in our garden too everything was growing. The beans we had protected from the ducks twined around diagonally leaning canes and formed wigwams with their dense broad-leaved foliage. The peas had made bushy plants with pods of the green vegetable lengthening towards the ground. The tomato plants had flowered and were exhibiting small green fruit, and our chili peppers were almost at the height of the back wall against which they had been planted. Patrick and Patricia had also become larger and developed beautiful feathers and wings, which gave them slight lift on their dashes across the garden. The young male duck was showing more curiosity than the female, but despite his boisterous nature and a character that was more domineering than the females, he remained wary of us and would stand back a few paces behind his partner when we approached them. From early on, the feathered family members had shown an interest in the green vegetables, but they had lain just beyond reach behind a shin-high barrier, which beaks had been behind the shin-high barrier which beaks had not been able to reach and legs had been unable to climb over, until young Patrick learnt to weigh the plastic mesh down by leaning his neck and upper body into it, after which he manoeuvred his legs upwards. Steve and I walked into the garden one day to see Pat springing up and down on the fence as if on a trampoline, grabbing a mouthful of bean leaves on each upper movement. Once we had discovered the duck's technique, we strengthened the fence by threading a line of wire through the top lattice of mesh and pulling it taut. In the coming weeks, every bean and pea had to be fought over, and the tomatoes seemed to resign themselves to the scrap heap as their leaves turned black and the fruit withered. Perhaps it was stress. The beans, however, provided a good yield and passed the inspection of the Major Maria, who seemed surprised that two English city folks were going to the effort of growing their own food, and from the half a dozen plants we produced so many beans, and at an earlier time than the plants that our neighbours themselves had planted. So many, in fact, that we were able to give some away, not only to them, but to Isabel at the kiosk and Julia at the cafe. Life continued around us. Many things were echoes of the sounds and sights that had occurred here the year before we came, and the many years before that too. Yet something of us accompanied the echoes, and on a starry night, not dissimilar to many others, Stephen and I sat on our veranda and we listened. We heard the sounds of cicadas, the mating calls of toads in the water tanks of our neighbours, the dogs barking on the terrace of another house further away, and added to this were the sounds of Patrick's developing quack, my voice and that of Stephen's. Muffin and Biscuit. The cats took to the changes around them in their strides, and grew more and more accustomed to life outdoors. Muffin remained the dominant character, but space allowed Biscuit her own life, and she had a choice to be something other than a punch bag. Perhaps the more aggressive siblings' energies were better focused anyway. Stephen and I had been finding gifts left to us outside the door to the summer room for a month or more. Small animals such as water voles from the stream outside and moles from the field next door were Muffin's favourite offerings. And both liked to play with and crunch grasshoppers. One day, though, Stephen was encouraged to rush to his camera when the chief assassin strolled into the garden with a snake hanging from her mouth, making her look like Fu Manchu. Friendship and time in Porto. Towards the end of the month, a friend from England came to stay, and because his flight arrived late at Porto Airport, he made the decision to stay in the centre of Porto for a couple of nights. Stephen and I were approaching our first anniversary, and because my friend had been able to make it to our wedding, he decided to make it up to us by treating us to a night in Porto while he was also there. The friendship between Gavin and I extended back more than 20 years. As in all relationships, sometimes our different personalities and perspective of things had led to clashes, but we had seen partners come and go, shared a house together for more than 2 years, and helped each other through the deaths of parents. So although I could not say that Gavin disliked Stephen, or vice versa, I felt that each expected a loyalty from me that the other resented. Stephen and I had followed up on the Portuguese lessons suggested by the electrician Miguel, and our hours lesson a week, which we both attended together, coincided with the day that we were off to Porto. So we attended the second of Christina's classes before leaving. When we arrived in Coimbra, we parked the car in a place we thought safe enough for it to stay the night, and bought our tickets to Campanha. The train journey was very good, and it took under an hour to arrive at Porto's main station, and from there we took a shuttle service to Estação São Bento. The light was beginning to fade as we left the place and walked in the direction that we believed the hotel to be. We had no concise map on us and had taken our instructions from a large street plan outside the station entrance. After walking first up, then down, then to the left of where we had begun our search, we started asking people we encountered if they knew the road or the hotel itself that we were looking for. 10, 15, 20 minutes passed, and I decided to phone Gavin and get the directions from him. The call failed to resolve the situation, however, because he had mistaken where I said we were, and his directions confused us even more. Using what we thought was some initiative, we asked a couple of taxi drivers who were standing by their cars talking. The cabbies were helpful and gave us directions, but it was not easy as not, but it was not as easy as a left and a right, and followed them our Portuguese followed them up until the third or fourth deviation only. After setting off in the direction that they had indicated, we lost sight of the cab drivers and went into a shop to ask. It was lucky that we had chosen just then to inquire, because it appeared that in a few metres we needed to change direction. I have lost track of how many people we spoke to, but nobody's directions took us to our location. And when we had been in Porto and on our feet for more than an hour, I called Gavin once more. The second phone call succeeded where the first had not, by firmly establishing our exact whereabouts at that time. And from there, we turned off down a side street and saw the hotel sign within a couple of minutes. Without much delay, we showered, changed, and went out for something to eat. We chose the restaurant for no particular reason, but were happy with the ambience and the food, which was not expensive. The temperature was warm enough to sit outside, but not too warm that we were bothered by flies. And after our meal, while we were walking back to our hotel, we came across a cafe down a side street. The tables outside were busy, but there was space enough for us to sit outside too. There was a live band playing a little outside the doors, and the music had a Latin feel to it, which on the warm evening fueled the holiday feeling. Having decided to have a drink, we stayed for a couple of hours chatting about nothing in particular and commenting on the very different atmosphere there is in countries where a warm, settled climate and a cafe rather than a pub culture have. In Britain, there's the idea that some parts of the day are for children and some are for adults. But in Portugal, that does not appear to be a clear-cut segregation. And outside a cafe in Porto, we witnessed all ages socialising and dancing in the limited space between tables as day met night and families welcomed the weekend. The next day, the three of us bought train tickets to leave for Coimbra around midday. And before taking the train, we had time to follow one of the walking routes that our guidebook laid out. Much as the residents of London do, Porto's inhabitants went about their Saturday morning routines, passing places they took for granted as the time at the time at the same time as tourists noted the different architectural styles and read what books they had to and read what books had to say about highlighted buildings. The last hour before catching the train was spent alongside the river, across from district occupied by the big port warehouses. We sipped coffee in an area overlooked by large letters that spelled out familiar names such as Coburn's and Taylor's, giving a glimpse of trade in wool and port between England and Portugal, which began in the 17th century. After arriving at Porto Companhia, we realised that there remained time to have dinner before travelling onwards to Coimbra. The buildings outside the station appeared neglected, and the places immediately visible to eat were outside on the street, where plastic chairs and plastic tables were the accompaniment to umbrellas. But a short walk revealed stairs from the street leading underground, and the menu on the wall out beside the downstairs flight informed us that below there were acceptable dishes and prices for us all. During Gavin's stay with us, we returned to Tomar and explored the Convento de Cristo, while on another we attended the monthly market in Villanova. We bought some bread and headed home. Then, a short distance from the market, a car pulled up alongside us, and the driver asked us if we wanted a lift. The man in the car was someone who we had seen before but never spoken to, nor did we know where he lived. But as the road we were walking down left little room for deviation, we accepted and were dropped off on the corner of our road. Other than exchanging a few words when we told the driver that the person with us was a friend from England, nothing was said. But before the man drove off, all three of us gave an obrigado. Without the incident involving the bathroom window, which had played out a couple of weeks previously, the dynamics between Gavin, Stephen, and me may have been different, but now I understood where my loyalties lay. I had learnt that being in a marriage required faith, and as with religious faith, there were times when logic had to be ignored. I was certain that on the night I dropped from the window, Stephen's instinct had pointed in a direction that was away from me, because nothing made sense. But he had fought to believe in a happy ending, and from that point on, I would fight to do the same. A significant event that happened during Gavin's visit was that I had a job interview at an English school in Queenborough.